Okay, so welcome everybody. This is the pre-recorded um, review session for exam 2. I'm sorry that we are unable to meet synchronously due to unforeseen circumstances. This is going to have to be the best that I could do at this point. I wanted to take the opportunity, though, to speak to you and to go through the exam 2 review sheet that I had posted. Hopefully, everybody has been taking a look over this review sheet and has actually gotten started um, with studying for the exam. So there's only 3 chapters worth of material on this that's going to be covered on the exam. So we should be able to get through this material pretty quickly. I want to highlight, some important aspects or I want to take the opportunity to kind of clarify um, each of these topics, like what exactly about these topics you should be focusing on. So, exam 2 will be very similar to exam 1. Um, again, there will only be 3 chapters covered on this exam. There will still be 50 multiple choice questions, then you'll have an hour and 15 minutes, which is a full class time to complete it. It'll be due before Saturday, um, October 23rd at 11:59 p.m. Okay, so the chapters covered will include chapters 5, chapter 6, and chapter 7. And let's take a look at some of the individual topics that you should be focusing on. So for chapter 5, we'll start off with how are the ABCs, quote unquote, ABCs of social psychology related to prejudice, stereotyping, and discrimination. Well, if you remember back to, I believe it was chapter 3, when we talked about the ABCs of the self, right? The different components of the social self. A referring to affect, B referring to behaviors, C referring to cognitions. So how are these 3 components of the self, or these 3 components that we study within social psychology, related to prejudice, stereotyping, and discrimination? Well, if you remember, prejudice is how we feel towards a group of people or towards a person because of their group membership. It's a negative feeling, right? So when we talk about affect, prejudice is the affective component. This is the emotional component. Um, the B part of this refers to behavior. So when we speak of behaviors in this context, the chapter 5 context, we're talking about discrimination. So this is treating people differently based on their group membership or perceived group membership. And C refers to cognition. So as it relates to the chapter 5 material, this is referring to stereotypes. Stereotypes are the thoughts that we have towards particular groups of people or individuals that belong to different groups, right? Not all stereotypes are necessarily bad. Some are neutral, and some stereotypes can actually be positive, right? But these are thoughts. These are cognitions. So what are the main differences between prejudice, stereotypes, and discrimination? Well, kind of covered that in the first bullet point there, right? So one of these is how we feel towards a person or a group of people. The other is what we think of a person because of their group membership, or how we think about the group itself. And the other is how we behave, how we treat people because of their group membership, right? So how is modern racism different from quote unquote old fashioned racism? Well, when we talk about old-fashioned racism, this is, I mean, it definitely still exists, but it's increasingly rare. Um, Being racist is not socially acceptable anymore, um, in most circles, right? So you're less likely to see racism um, manifest as in a stereotypical type of way, where people are outwardly expressing their hatred for particular groups. Um, Instead, because it's not socially acceptable to be racist, um, people have kind of gone undercover, so to speak, in terms of their racist beliefs. And this manifests in what we call modern racism. So modern racism is more subtle, and it's more likely to come about when the person feels that it's safe to do so. So it might be, only some racist type of thinking or racist types of expressions that are occurring when they feel the person feels that they're in good company, so to speak, that they're with like-minded people, or it's presented as a joke, not something that was meant to be taken seriously, so on and so forth. So modern racism is a lot more subtle than, say, institutional type of Jim Crow kind of racism that we've had in the past. And this is kind of related to how benevolent sexism is different from hostile sexism. So when we talk about sexism, there's two components to sexism. There's this hostile component where people will actively believe that women are inferior and that women um, should not have certain jobs that men have, and that women's role should be in the household, essentially, right? That they shouldn't have as much sexual freedom as men do, so on and so forth. But then there's this other component of sexism that's called benevolent sexism. And we kind of think of this as chivalry, right? So this benevolent sexism, um, the underpinnings are that, women are essentially weak and they need protection from men. Um, that they need to be coddled, they need to be cared for, and when we take a look at this kind of dichotomy, um, it's not always clear cut, because even people who will consider themselves to be pretty feminist or pretty progressive when it comes to sex equality will still say, yeah, maybe the guy should pay on the first date, right? Maybe there are still, maybe they should hold the door open for a woman. Um, this seems okay, and for a lot of people, it is totally okay, right? But then there are others who would say that, well, this is actually a form of benevolent sexism, right? By treating women as if they need some kind of protection, or they need some kind of coddling from men, it actually is a form of infantilizing. I can't say the word. It's making them seem less than, right? It's taking away agency. So yeah, sexism again is one of these things. Just like stereotypes are not necessarily always bad, right? Even though they are, because you're ultimately making a broad generalization. And even when it comes to sexism, benevolent sexism, thinking that, women need the protection of men, you might say, well, what's wrong with that? That often leads to repercussions down the line that you might not even think about, right? Is that, well, women can't be in positions of leadership, because they're too weak, or, women can't have certain jobs because they wouldn't be able to handle a difficult situation. So just understand that sexism can have these two components. One is blatantly hostile towards women, and the other one actually appears, more loving or more caring towards women, but can still be damaging in that regard. So, what did Sheriff Roberts Cave study involve? What did it illustrate about how tensions between groups is formed and how it can be diminished? Well, Roberts Cave, you could go back and watch the lecture I did on this, and I didn't even do a great job explaining it because I felt that I was talking way too much. But your book does a really good job at explaining this. And of course, anything you don't understand, YouTube is a fantastic source of information. You could always just go listen to someone else explain it, in a different way or in a more detailed way. But essentially, what this study showed is that it is so incredibly easy for us to get into this us versus them mentality. Remember, the Roberts Cave study involved a group of white, upper middle class teenage boys or pre-teenage boys, right? And as soon as all they needed to know was that, well, we're part of this group, and then there's another group in the same complex, on the same campground as us. And all of a sudden it became us versus them. And what does it illustrate about how tensions are formed? Well, almost automatically, right? It showed how people who were incredibly similar to one another were able to develop this in-group and out-group mentality, this us versus them type of mentality. And what did it show about how this tension can be diminished? Well, just having these two groups interact with one another actually made the problem worse. Having these two groups who, once they learned of each other's existence, they became really paranoid. They became really in-group oriented, right? So we need to protect ourselves from this outside threat. Again, they're just teenage boys. They posed no real threat to each other. But when the researchers had these two groups come together to even play basketball or play baseball with each other, or even just to dine together in a dining hall, it always ended up into segregation, number one, and often into fights, physical altercations. So what ultimately led to a reduction in tension? Well, what led to the reduction in tension was that the researchers had to pose obstacles or pose problems for both groups to solve that would be beneficial to both groups. So the take-home message of that study is that, number one, it is really, really easy for us to get into the us versus them type of mindset. Number two, just having contact between the us versus them isn't going to solve anything. It oftentimes will make things worse. And one way to help make things better is to have the groups come together and work together on goals that will be mutually beneficial. Okay? And that's going to relate back to that last bullet point here. So what does the jigsaw classroom refer to? And how effective is it? Well, the jigsaw classroom kind of models exactly the results of the Roberts Cave study. So the jigsaw classroom is a type of learning technique or type of learning modality that is often used in the classroom. It particularly K through 12, and mostly in elementary schools is where I've seen the research, but certainly in middle schools as well. But the idea is to get people from different backgrounds and people from different groups to come together and work on a problem or try to find a solution to a particular issue that's going to be mutually beneficial to both of those people. When we see, during the lecture in chapter 5, this was a longer lecture because lots of things to talk about. But I said, living in New York City, where I was encountered with, a whole bunch of different people from different races and religions and sexual orientations, gender identity, everything you can imagine. New York City is about as diverse as it can get, right? I don't think it was any less racist or sexist or homophobic or transphobic or intolerant or less biased in any kind of way, right? Everyone kind of went to their own neighborhoods. New York City is very segregated, not just based on race and ethnicity, but based on socioeconomic status, and those two things often go hand in hand. But yeah, I would just think about, okay, you get to experience or see all these different people walking around in the streets of New York City or on the subway, but do you really interact with them in any way? Are you really having dinners with them? Are you having any type of meaningful interaction that is mutually beneficial to both people? And yeah, the answer is no, right? Typically not. And that's not just my anecdotal experience. That's what the research suggests. So the Jigsaw Classroom is designed to get people of different backgrounds at a very early age to learn how to cooperate and work on goals that are mutually beneficial. And it's been very effective. It's been shown to be very effective at reducing things like bias and prejudice and stereotyping and discrimination. Again, the idea here is to work together on goals that will benefit everybody. Okay, so I skipped ahead a little bit there. So compare and contrast conflict theory, social categorization theory, and relative deprivation. Well, conflict theory, we're really talking about what's known as realistic conflict theory. And realistic conflict theory does not necessarily need to be realistic, right? So when we talk about realistic conflict theory, this is a perceived realistic threat that another group may pose. So something that we hear a lot about, not even just in the United States, it's all over the world. Xenophobia, fear of the others, this is likely rooted in our DNA, right? People that are from an out group who belong to an out group, it was probably evolutionarily advantageous for us to kind of be suspicious of them and to kind of want to protect our group, to help us survive. So the things that got us this far as quote-unquote civilized animals, right, civilized human beings here, don't necessarily work very well in society. And society is pretty freaking new. Talking about only a few thousand years old that we've had civilization. So our primitive brains haven't really caught up. So when it comes to conflict theory, sometimes it is a real battle that one group might hate the other group because they're fighting over a very limited resource. So when we take a look at the issues that go on in Palestine and Israel, a lot of people will think of this as, a religious type of conflict, a religious war. And there might be some component to that, right? Some component of an in-group, out-group thing going on there. But there's something, severely lacking in that region. Land and water, right? Arable land that you could actually grow food on. So a lot of the conflict between Palestinians and Israelis can really be boiled down to as a realistic conflict theory, right? Or a realistic conflict. It's more of an issue of land and territory. Now, in this country and in European countries, anytime you have migrations, you have migrant workers coming in, some people will be inclined to perceive them as being a threat, particularly when it comes to jobs. Like, well, these are people who are going to take our jobs, right? And the fact of the matter is that, we have a quote-unquote labor shortage in this country. There are plenty of restaurants that they have to cut back the number of hours or the number of days even that they're open because there's not enough people who are going to do those jobs anymore. They're pretty shitty jobs. If you've ever worked retail or you ever worked in fast food, you know how bad those jobs are, right? They pay shit and you have to deal with a bunch of horrible people. And something with the pandemic flipped the switch in people's minds that made them say, yeah, but I'm not doing that, life is too short, right? So we never really had a realistic conflict when it came to migrant workers trying to take American jobs, but it's often perceived that way, and that can lead to in-group, out-group type of mentality and lead to prejudice, lead to discrimination. Social categorization theory, well, this basically just says that we, as humans, love to put things in groups. We love to organize things, right? We love to see patterns even when there aren't any patterns. Go ahead and take a look up at the sky. Go look at the clouds. Stare at them long enough. You're going to start seeing shapes in those clouds. There are no shapes there. There are no faces. There are no elephants or whatever the hell it is you're seeing, but your brain is seeing patterns, right? We often see patterns where they don't exist. And social categorization theory says, yeah, we do that with people too, right? We like to categorize people. We like to put people into neat little boxes. We like to find patterns in behavior or thinking or whatever the case may be between people. The problem, of course, with social categorization theory, on the surface, you might say, okay, what's wrong with that? Well, when you put somebody into a category that you don't put yourself into, well, now they're an out-group member, right? They're not part of your in-group. And we know the problem that in-group, out-group type of tension and in-group, out-group type of mentality can cause. When it comes to relative deprivation, this is when we might feel bias or might feel negative attitudes, prejudice towards a group of people who we believe have it better off than we do, let's say. So we might, despise a group of people or not like a group of people because we think, they have it too good. They have it better than we do. A big part of the whole issue about raising the minimum wage. You see people who I have plenty of people in my family who are in healthcare, um, doing nursing assistant or doing home health aides, and they kind of get pissed when they're like, "What? You're going to, pay someone who flips burgers for a living? You're going to pay them the same money that I get paid? I have to change people's diapers. I have to do all this, horrible stuff." So, in that regard, I mean, these are both shitty jobs, right? They're not good jobs, but some person is going to feel like they're getting cheated out, right? Because they feel that they have it worse than someone else. Um, and instead of fighting the boss, fighting the corporation or the company, they're instead going to take it out on their colleague, on their worker who's making the same crap money. And again, if you've ever worked in retail or ever worked in fast food, those are not good jobs. So relative deprivation is where you basically start turning on each other because you think there's an unfairness there. Um, Instead of turning to turning your angst upwards to the people who actually create these working conditions for you. Okay, so how does social identity theory explain the causes of in-group favoritism? Well, social identity theory goes way back to chapter 3 in terms of how we come to know ourselves, how we come to develop a sense of self, a self-concept, right? And social identity theory says that when we feel threatened, and it could be physically, or it could be when our self-esteem feels threatened, we're more likely to show in-group favoritism. Why? Well, by showing in-group favoritism, number one, that connects us to our in-group, thus offering us potential physical protection, if we're thinking about it from an evolutionary perspective. But also, showing in-group favoritism helps with our self-esteem. It helps us make us feel better about ourselves. When I do something nice for someone who is a member of my in-group, I feel good about myself, right? How do collectivist and individualistic societies differ in their treatments of in-groups and out-groups? This is a complicated question, right? So it depends. Individualistic societies, like the United States, put more emphasis on individual freedom, individual autonomy. We're much more accepting of differences, say, amongst individuals. It's almost pretty amazing when you take a look at some other countries around the world, how there's all of this ethnic fighting that goes on. And it's, literally between a tribe that believes one version of one belief system and a tribe that believes a slightly different version of the same belief system. And they're constantly at war and trying to wipe each other off the face of the earth. The United States is actually, we definitely have our problems here. But from a social psychological perspective, we actually tolerate a lot of individual differences. That means we have, let's say, a more liberal view in terms of deviating from our in-groups, right? We're allowed to be, less conformist, let's say, within our in-groups. There's still lots of pressure for us to conform, which we'll talk about in a minute. But compared to collectivist cultures, Collectivist cultures are not likely to, they're less likely to tolerate those types of deviations from the group. You're expected to really kind of stick to your in-group more. Um, However, they're less likely to show in-group type of favoritism, or less likely to get this type of boost of self-esteem by identifying with the in-group. Why? Well, because in collectivist cultures, that in-group mentality is usually born out of necessity. Collectivist cultures just tend to be more collectivist because they tend to be poorer, economically speaking, and they tend to be more homogeneous. So you have less differences. Um, you have cultures that are pretty much the same. You don't have this type of mixing pot that you would have in the United States. So there are, pluses and minuses between these two different types of cultures when it comes to in groups and out groups. So what is the difference between the out group homogeneity effect and the in group heterogeneity effect? Well, take a look at those words. Out group homogeneity effect, right? Homo, same. So when we talk about the out group homogeneity effect, this is essentially, well, they're all the same, right? So we tend to perceive or overestimate the similarities between individuals that belong to outgroups, right? It's kind of, again, well, they're all the same. They all, one is like the other. And when it comes to the in-group heterogeneity effect, we tend to overestimate the differences, or tend to overestimate, the individuality. So yeah, within our group, we tolerate, a lot more differences. We're all unique within our in group, but those people, they're all the same, right? So that's how we can think about those two terms. How can the self-fulfilling prophecy help confirm stereotypes? Well, let's think about what the self-fulfilling prophecy is. The self-fulfilling prophecy is a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? The best way to explain this is to give an example. If you grew up, in a not so great environment, and you were told by your parents that you would never amount to anything, that you were going to end up, being a loser, being a junkie, ending up in jail, whatever the case may be. Somebody, your parents in this case, set a standard of behavior for you, right? They set an expectation for you. And the way that they treat you is essentially going to elicit those types of behaviors, right? So you're constantly being told that you're stupid and that you're going to fail in school. Well, then you're not really going to try very hard in school, let's say, right? Because what's the use? This is all you know. This is all you've been told. Is that you suck, right? So you don't try, and then you end up failing, and then your parents, these abusive parents, take a look at your failing grades and say, "Ha! I knew it. I knew it all along. Didn't I tell you you were a loser? You were going to drop out of school?" Okay, that's the self-fulfilling prophecy there. So how does it relate to confirming stereotypes? Well, if you have a stereotype and you treat a person from a particular group in a stereotypical way, you might elicit stereotypical behaviors from them. And by doing so, you're confirming your stereotype, right? So you're basically causing people to act in certain ways that support your pre-existing beliefs of them. And why are stereotypes so hard to overcome? Well, short answer is that the brain is lazy, and stereotypes are they're cognitive heuristics, they're mental shortcuts. Um, these are beliefs that we have that basically spare us the burden of actually having to learn about an individual or their culture. Um, they're useful. In most cases, heuristics are useful. And when it comes to stereotyping, the problem is that we're applying it to people. And heuristics aren't always right, you know. You're going to get them wrong a lot of the times, and that could have real world repercussions on others. But yeah, the brain's lazy. Stereotype activation is an automatic process. Um, and we tend to also engage in confirmation bias. So we tend to pay attention to when people behave in stereotypical ways to confirm our stereotypes. And when people behave in non-stereotypical ways, we tend to ignore that. We don't tend to process it, right? Okay, so moving on to chapter 6. What is an attitude? Well, an attitude is a feeling towards an object or a person or a thing. And that thing could even be an idea, right? And how do positive and negative reactions interact to form indifference, ambivalence, positive attitudes, and negative attitudes? Well, you can think of an attitude as existing on two levels, right? Is that you have either a high or low positive feeling towards something, or you have a high or low negative feeling towards something. So a positive attitude is when you have a strong positive feeling towards something and a low negative feeling towards something. A negative attitude is when you have a high negative attitude towards something and a low positive attitude towards something. Indifference is when you have a low positive attitude and a low negative attitude, or a low positive feeling and a low negative feeling. You're indifferent. You don't really care, right? Ambivalence, on the other hand, is when you have a strong positive feeling and a strong negative feeling. So ambivalence is actually getting close to what we call cognitive dissonance. Ambivalence is a conflict, right? You feel strongly both ways about something. So what are the advantages and disadvantages with associated with the overt measures of attitudes? Well, when we talk about the overt measures, we're really talking about asking people their attitudes, survey research. The advantages, of course, are there are some things that you really just need to ask people. How do you feel about this, right? There's some things that there's really no other way to kind of measure. You just have to ask people. Also, survey research is quick, it's cheap. The disadvantages, of course, are that people can forget and people can lie. People often want to present themselves in socially desirable ways. So if you gave somebody a racism scale, you need to be concerned about whether or not they're going to answer those questions truthfully, right? What are some of the covert measures for assessing attitudes? How do they work? Well, the covert measures are the ones that are looking at attitudes in an indirect way. So we're not explicitly directly asking someone, what do you think about this, or how do you feel about that? Instead, we're trying to assess behaviors, or in the case of the next bullet point, the implicit associations test, we're trying to infer attitudes based on reaction speed, right? And how closely or how accurately participants are matching up positive words with, positive or negative words with particular objects or people or ideas, right? So how do they work? Well, they're a little bit, they're pretty inferential. That's one of the major criticisms of the implicit associations test. And you hopefully have completed assignment 2 before this exam. So you know how the IIT works. And if you don't, I'm not going to tell you now. Go do assignment 2 before the exam, right? But it claims to measure implicit associations. That's in the name, but a lot of researchers will use this to essentially claim that it's measuring implicit bias. And that is where one of the criticisms comes from. Again, if you to learn more about the criticisms, complete assignment 2, where you have to read a brief New York Times piece article that lays out some of the major criticisms. Of course, your book explains this as well. But yeah, just because we have associations, that doesn't mean that we act on them, so to speak. So I've done the implicit association test many times before, and one test that I show a preference for is when it comes to how quickly I pair female faces with household types of items, right? And some researchers might say, okay, well, you have an implicit bias, for women staying at home and men in the workplace. And I would say, well, that's, maybe, I don't know, right? This is not my area of expertise, but I'm just going to go out on a limb here and say that my mother was a housewife. Her mother was a housewife. My grandmother was a housewife. Like, I just grew up with these types of associations, right? So it would make sense that my brain would be more readily associating, certain household things with, say, female faces rather than male faces. That doesn't mean I act on them or that I'm biased in any way. Quite the opposite, right? I consider myself a feminist, part of the affiliated member of the Women in Gender Studies faculty. But yeah, this is an implicit association I have. Does that equate to bias? No, not necessarily, right? But it's something that is good for me to know. So if I start thinking in certain ways, I can rely on this and say, hey, are you making this, are you relying on an implicit association here? So the main criticism of this is that it's not an implicit bias test or an implicit racist test or homophobia test or anything like that. We're products of our culture. So whatever your test results were, I hope you didn't feel bad about them. If anything, just know, like, okay, that association might exist, and you might need to recognize that it exists, just to make sure you're not relying on it when dealing with people or when making decisions, right? Okay, what are some factors that determine the strength of an attitude? Well, we typically will care about things that are more related to us. So you likely are indifferent, don't really give a shit about stuff that has nothing to do with you, right? So that would be one of the strongest factors, is how relevant is this attitude object, or this attitude um, item, whatever it is. I forget how your book describes it, but you know, this, I don't know, this person, idea, or the thing, right? Like, how relevant is it to you? If it really doesn't affect your life in any way, you're likely not going to have a strong attitude towards it or them in general. Also, though, there are cultural factors. So if you were brought up to believe that something is, very right or very wrong, well, then you might have, strong attitudes towards particular objects or ideas or people, related to that attitude. But essentially, it comes down to, how personally relevant is this thing to you. Central versus peripheral processing of information. What is involved in each? When are we more likely to engage in one over the other? Okay, so the central and peripheral routes of processing are two components of what's known as the elaboration likelihood model. And this explains how we process information, but also how we can be persuaded, or on the flip side, how we can persuade other people. So when we take a central route of processing, we're paying attention to the message. We're paying attention directly to what is being said, and we're processing that information. The central route processing requires two things. It requires that we're able to understand the message that we're receiving, so we're able to understand what is being said to us, and that we are motivated to process that information. So even if you're a super smart college student showing up to class, you're certainly capable of processing that information, but maybe you had no sleep the night before, or maybe you're having a crummy time. You're depressed, you're anxious, you're whatever. It's mid-semester, right? And you have a social psych test you have to take. You might be really not motivated to pay attention, right? So the central route requires capability and motivation. And when we take the central route, we're going to pay attention to what is being said, and we're going to be persuaded by the strength of the argument that's being made. When we take a peripheral route, when either we're not able to understand what's being said, so someone's talking a whole bunch of stuff that's just going right over our heads, we have no idea what's being said, or we just don't give a shit. We just don't have the motivation. We don't have the patience to pay attention. So in that case, we're not going to be paying attention to what's actually being said or be persuaded by what's being said. Instead, we're going to be persuaded by these peripheral cues. So instead of being persuaded by what's being said, we're going to be more persuaded by how it's said, right? So instead of just me showing this black and white text here, if you're taking a peripheral route, you might be more impressed if I had some fancy PowerPoint presentations and a whole bunch of jokes, and then, if I dressed well or bothered to comb my hair or anything before I did this video. We would rely on all of those peripheral cues because, well, this person speaks really well. They use really big words. They must know what they're talking about, right? Chances are, no, they don't, right? What effect does mood have on persuasion? Well, something known as mindless compliance, right? We're more likely to be persuaded when we are in a good mood. Why? Well, when we're in a good mood, we tend to be motivated to try to stay in a good mood. And thinking thinking critically is not really fun for us. So to stay in a good mood, we're probably gonna just go along with what is being said and agree, and that way our brain doesn't have to think too much, and we don't have to have conflicting thoughts, and we get to stay in our happy place, essentially, right? So positive mood, good moods, lead to more persuasion. Think about when you're depressed, or if you have a friend who's depressed and incredibly cynical. These people are really difficult to persuade, right? They're going to be questioning everything, sometimes to a fault, where you're like, oh, geez, like, you have to criticize everything? Do you have to question everything? Can you just enjoy something, right? So good moods equal more persuasion, essentially. So are scare tactics ever effective at persuading people? And if so, what needs to be included? Well, yes, scare tactics can be very effective at persuading people. Two things need to be included. Number one, the scare tactic has to be reasonable. It can't be ridiculous, like some of those anti-drug commercials that I spoke about during lecture that I grew up with. So it has to be a reasonable fear, but also what needs to be included is that you need to provide the person with a way to eliminate the fear, right? So one of the reasons why all those really bad anti-drug campaigns of the 80s and 90s, why they were so unsuccessful is, number one, they were ridiculous. Like, oh, you smoke some weed and you're going to jump off a building. Like, nobody believed that, number one, right? And then that was it. They just ended it right there. Okay, so I guess I'm just going to smoke weed and jump off a building, right? Put that in contrast to the anti-smoking campaign that New York City did, and a number of cities did, but the early 2000s, where it was much more reasonable in terms of, like, these are the long-term effects of smoking. No, you smoking a pack of cigarettes right now, you're not going to die, right? That would be idiotic to say. But yeah, no, over the years, look at, these are the long-term effects. These are the stats. They're not good, right? And then what did New York City do? At the end, they had a hotline, 1-800 New York City Quit, whatever the hell it was, where you can call and they would give you free Nicorette gum or nicotine patches or free anti-smoking treatment, right? So yeah, they scared you into wanting to quit, and then they gave you a way to reduce the fear. And when you do this, it can be very effective. So what does the primacy and recency effect refer to? Well, just think of the names, right? It refers to what information we're more likely to pay attention to and remember later on. So we're more likely to remember and pay attention to information that is presented at the beginning of an argument or at the beginning of a presentation, and the information that is towards the end of the information or the presentation. So we tend to kind of tune out or forget the information that is presented in the middle. What does the research say about the effectiveness of subliminal messages? Well, the research is pretty conflicted, but one thing is for sure is that it doesn't work the way that they present it in the movies. Subliminal messaging can act as kind of like a priming effect. So, yeah, if you were thirsty to begin with when you walked into the movie theater, and during the movie you keep seeing, people drinking water or a can of Coke or something like that, yeah, you might be more likely to go to the concession stand and buy a soda, right? Buy a can of Coke. But if you don't drink soft drinks, if you don't drink, Coke, Cola, or Pepsi or anything, no matter how much subliminal messaging that you see during that movie, it's not going to make you go buy a can of Coke, right? So essentially, subliminal messaging can have some effect in let's say encouraging you to do something that you would normally already do, right? So it's not going to make you do something that you wouldn't ordinarily do. What is cognitive dissonance, and what do humans do to avoid or get rid of it? Well, cognitive dissonance is when we hold two conflicting thoughts, or when our behaviors and our beliefs are incongruent. They don't match up. What does this do? Well, it creates a sense of dissonance, of cognitive dissonance, a sense of uneasiness. And it's not necessarily, the new approaches to cognitive dissonance say it's not necessarily purely cognitive. It actually will produce a physiological dissonance, a physiological discomfort. So you should be aware of the original studies in cognitive dissonance, and understand again how do humans avoid it. Well, ideally we would, if we have two conflicting thoughts, or if our behaviors don't match up with our thoughts, and this is causing us dissonance and discomfort, well, we should change one of them, right? It's either we change our behavior to make it more in line with our thinking, or we should change our thinking to make it more in line with our behavior. But we rarely ever do that. There's a whole list of defense mechanisms that I presented in this chapter lecture, and that's in your textbook, and you should be familiar with a few of them, some of the big ones in there. What does self-perception theory say about how attitudes are formed and changed? Well, self-perception theory really only kicks in when we're not sure how we feel about certain things. So when we don't know, whether you don't know whether you like your social psych professor here. You may say, I don't know about this guy. I don't know if I like this guy. Well, you might think, I do read all the emails that he sends. I do read all the lectures. I laugh at some of his stupid jokes. Okay, I guess he's not so bad, right? So what did you just do? According to self-perception theory, well, you didn't know how you thought about me, so you had to think about how do you act towards me. Essentially, you start to perceive yourself. You start to perceive your own behavior towards that attitude subject, me, in this example, and say, okay, well, I guess I like him enough, good enough, right? Or maybe the opposite. Maybe you say, God, I can't stand listening to this guy. I fast forward through as much of his lectures as possible. I never read any of his emails. I must really not like them. Right? So self-perception theory says when we don't know how we feel about something, we're going to start to turn towards our behavior and analyze our behavior to get an idea of how we feel about that thing or that person or that idea. Okay, so chapter 7 deals with conformity, compliance, and obedience, and you should know the difference between these. They all exist on a continuum, right? Conformity is when we change our behavior without being asked to do so. Compliance is when we change our behavior because we are asked to do so. And obedience is when we change our behavior because we're told to do so. Now, Sheriff's and Ash's studies on conformity actually, the next 2 bullet points are all 3 of these here are kind of related to one another, right? So Sheriff's and Ash's studies on conformity actually looked at different types of conformity. So Sheriff, if you remember, he had participants go into these dark rooms and projected a small beam of light, small dot of light on the wall, and because of the autokinetic effect in our eyes, people saw this dot, this little light as moving, right? It wasn't really moving, but we perceive it as moving because of the autokinetic effect. And then he would ask participants, so, how much did that light move? And nobody knew, right? Because it really didn't move at all. So they were basically taking guesses at this point. But then once they got into a group, their answers started to converge. So the more that they talked about it, their answers started to come together. Essentially, they were having they were conforming, right? They were reaching a consensus. But it's not because they wanted to fit in with the group at all. So it wasn't normative conformity. In Sheriff's study, their answers were conforming because of informational conformity, right? People didn't know what the right answer was, and we typically, have a need to know. We have a need for cognition. We have a need to be right. And when we don't know something, we will tend to turn to the group and see, what do they think? Not that we want to fit in or that we fear that we're going to be rejected, but we think maybe they know something that we don't know, right? So Sheriff's study actually produced something that we would call private conformity. It actually changed people's minds. It changed their answers, right? Ash's study, on the other hand, remember these are the famous line studies where participants were asked to, pick out a line. Here's line A. Which of these 3 lines matches that line? And they were filled in a room with a bunch of Confederates who kept giving the wrong answer over and over again. And then what happened? Well, the majority of participants started to give the wrong answer as well, knowingly give the wrong answer. They knew damn well it was not the right answer, right? So what was happening? Well, they were demonstrating normative conformity. They wanted to go along with the group. They didn't want to appear deviant. So essentially what Ash's study did was produce quote-unquote public conformity. It didn't change their minds. They knew they were giving the wrong answer, but publicly they went along with the group. So understand what percentage of people in Ash's study conformed to the group. It depends, right? So I won't go into all of that because there were a couple of studies, I'll say the majority went along the majority of the time, but depending on the situation, those percentages change, particularly once there was an ally in the group, right? One other person who gave the right answer. What did that do to conformity rates? Also understand what the role of the law of diminishing returns has in the probability that an individual will conform to a group. Essentially, it means that the more people that are part of a group, the more pressure there will be for you to conform up to a point, right? So say up to, I'm just pulling this out of the thin air now, but let's say the pressure, you keep increasing the number of people in the group, and the pressure to conform will increase and increase until, let's say, you reach 10 people or so. I'm pretty sure that was about what Ash found in the study. Maybe it was a little lower. Maybe it was like 7 or 8. But yeah, then at that point, it doesn't matter if it's 10 people or 20 people. Right? You're not going to see an exponential increase in conformity just because the group size is increasing. At some point, the effect of the group size is going to level off. Okay, why does having an ally reduce majority influence on our behavior? Well, there's a couple of reasons that are proposed here. The one that I talked about mostly was that having an ally basically creates another group for you to join, right? So again, when we're talking about normative conformity, this is the pressure for you to go along with the group, to go along with the group. Well, once one other person steps up and is being a dissenter, who's going against the group, let's say, well, now you have another group to join. So you won't be completely ostracized. You won't be completely rejected. You could be accepted by this new group that has essentially been formed. What does Moscovici say about the ways in which majorities and minorities exert influence? Well, this goes into this idea of the next bullet point here, the dual process approach about majorities and minorities, right? So essentially, majorities have their power to influence based on their sheer number. There's a lot of them. They're the majority, right? They're the big social group. They're going to exert their pressure for you to conform because you want to be part of the in crowd. You want to be part of the big group, right? Minority opinions, minority or dissenters, people who go against that group, will produce, or more likely to produce, private conformity. Meaning, we see people who go against the grain as being genuine. Maybe there's something, maybe they're onto something, right? They're more likely to change our opinions privately, even if we still conform and go along with the majority group. The minority groups, or the minority faction of this group, might actually change our private beliefs, or we would engage in what's known as private conformity at that point. Individualism versus collectivism. This has been a running theme throughout the class. Just, brush up on that. What is the norm of reciprocity, and what role does it play in compliance? Well, the norm of reciprocity is the golden rule. Do unto others as you would have done unto you, right? Or I scratch your back, you scratch my back. This tit for tat type of relationship. What role does that play in compliance? Well, if I do something for you, you're likely to feel the need to reciprocate. which means that if I do a favor for you, you're likely to feel a strong need to return that favor. And a lot of this next bullet point here, you should be familiar with the major techniques that are used for compliance, such as the foot in the door technique, and the door in the face technique, and the lowballing technique. They all tend to rely on this norm of reciprocity. This is, the golden rule for a reason. It transcends all cultures and all religions, and even people who have no religion still, feel this norm of reciprocity. It's rooted in our DNA, in our evolutionary makeup. The key about the norm of reciprocity is that it's pretty short-lived. So, you can't drive your friend to the airport next week, and then 3 years later, ask them to drive you to Florida or something and say, hey, remember when I drove you there? It doesn't really last that long. You kind of need to cash in pretty quickly. But understand the different major techniques for compliance. There's likely to be a question on the exam that says, hey, this person did this, which compliance technique are they taking advantage of? So be able to identify them. Okay, so what are the major implications of the Milgram study? Well, number one, brush up on the Milgram study. I'm sure this class is not the first time you learned about it, but the major implications are actually pretty disturbing, right? That it doesn't really take a lot for us to obey authority, or to incrementally go along with increasingly horrific behaviors because we're told to do so. And in the Milgram study, the participants weren't even threatened in any type of way, right? The prompts that they were given were just, all the study requires you to continue, right? And most people did. Most people did continue. Now, one thing I'll say for this bullet point is that you should know because Milgram, this was a series of studies. This lab did this experiment in many different settings with many different factors. So be aware of some of the factors that decreased obedience, right? An example would be if we had a teacher and a learner, right? The teacher was the real experimenter who was administering or thought they were administering shocks to a learner. Well, when the learner was in the room with the person, obedience dropped, right? When the teacher, the participant, actually had to touch the learner, had to put the electrodes on, this person they thought that they were shocking, obedience levels dropped. So there are a number of things that influence whether or not people would obey. A big one was having an ally, having one other participant, quote unquote participant, they were in on the study, who said, I'm not going to do it. Obedience almost tanked completely, right? So there are a number of factors involved in the Milgram study. And then finally, what characteristics are associated with not an anti-authoritarian, with an authoritarian personality. So read up on authoritarian personality again. The idea of personality traits kind of rubs us the wrong way as social psychologists for this class, right? But yeah, this is something that we do recognize as maybe people might be more or less inclined to obey authority. Typically, the characteristics that are associated with an authoritarian personality are that people who are very rigid in their way of thinking, who very much respect and obey law and order. These are also people who will tend to, what we say, kiss up and kick down, right? So you kiss the ass of people who you think are above you or who are in positions of power, and you basically, treat people who you perceive as being below you, and you treat them like shit, essentially. And how is this related to the Milgram study? Well, having an authoritarian personality is associated with more obedience to authority figures. Actually associated with more compliance rates as well. Okay, that's an hour and 15 minutes. One class lecture. I was able to get it done. Now an hour and 16 minutes. I'm only 1 minute over, but not too bad. So send me any questions you have. Hopefully you found this review helpful. I'll see you next time for a live session for the next exam. In the meantime, good luck. I don't think you'll need it. Hopefully you are well prepared for this exam. Take care, everyone. See you soon.